Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. This time we're tackling something that I know a lot of you have asked about. We're diving deep into French conditional sentences, specifically those tricky C clauses. Now I know French grammar can seem a little overwhelming sometimes, but trust me, we're going to break this down, make it clear, concise, and dare I say, even fun. Especially for those of you working towards your pronunciator certificate on this topic, we want to make sure you're feeling confident and ready to ace that test. So to help us navigate these grammatical waters, I've got an expert here with me who's going to help us unpack the ins and outs of C clauses. We're going to cover the three main types you need to know. And we'll delve into those verb tenses and conjugations. We'll even touch on some idiomatic expressions and common pitfalls for English speakers. So are you ready to unlock the secrets of French conditional sentences?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
So maybe we can start with a broad question. When you use conditional sentences in French, what are you actually trying to express? Like, what's the purpose of these C clauses?
Well, they let you express all sorts of possibilities and hypotheses. You can talk about things that might happen in the future, or even things that could have happened in the past but didn't. They're really useful for exploring those what-if scenarios.
What-if scenarios. I like that. It makes them sound a lot less scary already. So, okay, let's break it down. I know there are three main types of C clauses, right?
Right.
Each with its own set of rules.
Yep.
Can you walk us through those?
Absolutely. So let's start with type 1. This type is all about real and possible situations in the present or future. The key here is to use the present tense in the C clause and then the future tense in the main clause.
Okay, so for example, if I say, si je mange trop de chocolat, je serai malade. If I eat too much chocolate, I will be sick. That's a type 1 conditional sentence because the real possibility.
Exactly. You've used the present tense mange in the C clause and the future tense serait in the main clause. That's exactly how you form a type 1 conditional sentence. And let's be honest, it is a real possibility.
Sadly, very true. Too true. Now, what about type 2? What makes that one different from type 1?
Type 2 takes us into the realm of the hypothetical. It deals with situations that are unlikely or imaginary in the present. So like imagine you're daydreaming about winning the lottery. You might say, si je gagnais au loto, je voyagerais autour du monde. Meaning, if I won the lottery, I would travel around the world.
Ah, so that's where the conditional tense comes in. Je voyagerais, I would travel. That ray ending is a dead giveaway, isn't it?
It is. The conditional tense in the main clause is the key to type 2 conditional sentences. And in the C clause, you use the imperfect tense, which in this case is gagnait.
Okay, so I'm starting to see a pattern here. Present tense plus future tense for real possibilities, and imperfect tense plus conditional tense for hypothetical situations. But we can't forget about those what-if moments about the past, right? That's where type 3 comes in.
Exactly. Type 3 conditional sentences are all about those situations in the past that are impossible to change. They often express a sense of regret or what could have been.
So if I'm like lamenting a missed opportunity, I might say something like, si j'avais étudié plus, j'aurais réussi l'examen. If I had studied more, I would have passed the exam.
Perfect example. You've used the pluperfect tense avait étudié in the C clause and the past conditional tense aurait réussi in the main clause. That combination is a classic type 3 conditional sentence.
This is starting to click into place. It's like those tenses are the puzzle pieces that fit together to create these different what-if scenarios. I have to admit, it's actually a lot less confusing now that we've broken it down.
I'm glad to hear that. But honestly, we've only just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to explore with conditional sentences, from negation and inversion to those tricky irregular verbs.
Hold on, irregular verbs and conditional sentences. Now you're just trying to scare me. But hey, I'm up for the challenge. But before we dive into those more complex areas, maybe we can just take a moment to appreciate how far we've come already. We've covered the three main types of C clauses and their corresponding tenses. That's a pretty solid foundation, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And remember, you can always revisit the pronunciator lessons if you want to solidify your understanding of each type of conditional sentence. That's one of the great things about Pronunciator. You can really learn at your own pace.
That's a great point. It's not about cramming everything in at once, right? It's about building that strong foundation and then adding those extra layers of complexity as we go. So, okay, now that we've tackled the basics, I think we're ready to dive into some of those trickier aspects of conditional sentences. What do you say? Are you ready?
Let's do it.
All right, let's go.
Let's start by taking a closer look at those verb conjugations, especially in the context of type 3 conditional sentences. That's where things can get a bit more intricate.
Intricate is one way to put it. All right, lead the way. I'm ready to conquer those verbs.
Welcome back, everyone. So let's unpack those verb conjugations a bit more, especially in the context of type 3 conditional sentences. You know where we're dealing with the past in those what-if moments. It involves the pluperfect tense in the C clause and the past conditional in the main clause.
Right, like, if I had studied harder, I would have aced that test. But I imagine things can get pretty tricky with irregular verbs, especially in the pluperfect.
Absolutely. Irregular verbs always add a layer of complexity. But remember, even those irregular verbs follow patterns. For example, let's think about verbs like faire, to do, and prendre, to take. In the pluperfect, their past participles fait and pris stay the same, regardless of the subject. So you'd have si j'avais fait or si tu avais pris.
Okay, so even though they're irregular, there's still some consistency there. That's actually reassuring. It's like finding a hidden order within the chaos of irregular verbs. So what about other irregular verbs? Are there any tips for navigating those in the pluperfect?
Well, a good approach is to focus on the most common irregular verbs and really practice their conjugations in the pluperfect. Think about verbs like dire, to say voir, to see, and être, to be. Pronunciator has excellent drills for practicing these. And don't forget, the more you practice, the more those irregular forms will become second nature.
Practice makes perfect right. Speaking of practice, let's tackle another question from our listeners. How do you form negative conditional sentences? I remember stumbling over those ne pas placements.
Negation, that's an important one. It's essential for expressing all those things you wouldn't do or wouldn't have done in those hypothetical situations. In conditional sentences, you generally place ne pas around the conjugated verb in the main clause.
Okay, so let's say I wanted to say, if I had money, I wouldn't buy a sports car. Something I'm sure many of us can relate to. How would I phrase that negatively?
You would say, si j'avais de l'argent, je n'achèterais pas une voiture de sport. You see how ne pas surrounds achèterais there.
Okay, that makes sense. It's similar to how we use ne pas in other negative sentences. What about negating the C clause itself, though? Does that follow the same rule?
It can, but it often creates a slightly different nuance. For example, si je n'avais pas d'argent, no, that implies a stronger emphasis on the lack of money being the condition.
Interesting. So it's not just about grammar, it's about those subtle shades of meaning.
Exactly. And those nuances are what make French so expressive. Now let's move on to another interesting feature of conditional sentences inversion. It's a stylistic choice, but it can add a touch of elegance and formality to your French.
Inversion. I vaguely remember learning about that, but it always seemed a bit intimidating. It's like you're turning the sentence inside out.
You could say that. Essentially, you reverse the subject and verb in the C clause. So, for example, instead of saying si tu viens, you would say viens-tu.
Viens-tu.
Yeah,
it does sound more elegant somehow. Is there a trick to remembering when you can use inversion in conditional sentences?
You can use it with type 1 and type 2 conditional sentences, but it's less common with type 3.
Okay, so I can impress my friends with my fancy inversions.
Yes.
In those hypothetical what-if situations, but I'll probably stick to the regular word order for those what could have been moments.
Exactly. And remember, Pronunciator has specific lessons and exercises dedicated to inversion, so you can practice there and gain confidence in using it.
Pronunciator is like our trusty sidekick on this French grammar adventure. Now, before we move on, I have to ask you about those idiomatic expressions. You know, the ones that pop up in conditional sentences. I find those fascinating because they give you a glimpse into the culture.
They're like little windows into the French soul.
Exactly.
Do you have any favorite idiomatic expressions that use conditional sentences?
Oh, definitely. One that comes to mind is si jeunesse savait, si vieillesse pouvait, which means if youth knew, if old age could. It's so poetic and speaks to that contrast between youthful enthusiasm and wisdom.
That's a beautiful one. It really captures the essence of those what-if thoughts about different stages of life. Now, there's one more question from our listeners that I'd like to address. Mixed conditional sentences. It's a slightly more advanced concept, but it can be incredibly useful for expressing complex ideas.
Mixed conditional sentences. That sounds intriguing. So is that like when you mix and match different types of C clauses in the same sentence?
You got it. It's basically when you combine elements of different types of conditional sentences to express a thought that spans different time frames or levels of reality.
Okay, my brain is trying to wrap itself around this. Can you give us an example?
Imagine you're thinking about how a past decision has affected your present situation. You might say something like, si j'avais appris à jouer du piano quand j'étais enfant, je pourrais donner un concert maintenant. If I had learned to play the piano when I was a child, I could give a concert now.
Wow, that's powerful. You've got the regret of not learning piano as a child, expressed with a type 3 conditional. And then the hypothetical possibility of giving a concert now, expressed with a type 2 conditional. It's like weaving together different layers of time and possibility.
Exactly. It's a sophisticated way of using conditional sentences to convey those more intricate thoughts that we all have. And as you prepare for the pronunciator certificate, understanding mixed conditional sentences will definitely give you an edge.
It's like unlocking a secret level of French grammar. But you know what? I'm not feeling overwhelmed by all this information. It's actually quite exciting. I'm starting to see how all these pieces of the conditional sentence puzzle fit together.
I'm thrilled to hear that. And remember, it's all about taking it step by step. You've mastered the fundamentals, and now you're adding those nuanced layers and discovering the real expressive power of these conditional sentences.
And to think this all started with those simple C clauses. Before we move on to our final thoughts, is there anything else we should cover in terms of like the mechanics of conditional sentences?
I think we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about verb conjugations, negation, inversion, idiomatic expressions. We've even touched upon mixed conditional sentences. I think you're well on your way to mastering this essential aspect of French grammar.
And I have to say, I'm feeling more confident than ever about those conditional sentences.
That's fantastic to hear. Now let's wrap up our deep dive with some final thoughts and insights. That will help you not only ace that pronunciator certificate, but also really appreciate the beauty and power of conditional sentences in French.
Lead the way, I'm all ears. All right, so we've made it to the final stretch of our deep dive into French conditional sentences. We've talked about the three main types, tackled those verb conjugations, even ventured into those idiomatic expressions and mixed conditionals. I'm feeling pretty good about my C clause game now.
That's great to hear. And remember, Pronunciator is there for you as you continue to practice and get ready for that certificate exam.
Absolutely. It's like having a French grammar guru right in my pocket.
Well,
Now, before we wrap up, you mentioned some final thoughts and insights, something beyond just the mechanics of conditional sentences. I'm curious to hear what you had in mind.
language is more than just a set of rules. It's a reflection of how we think and how we see the world.
Okay, I'm with you. So how do conditional sentences with all those hypothetical scenarios and what-ifs reflect the French way of thinking?
Well, some might say that the French, with their love of nuance and exploring different perspectives, are naturally drawn to conditional sentences. It's like those C clauses give them a way to express that way of thinking about the world,
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like those C clauses are a window into a different way of seeing things.
Exactly. And as you continue to learn French, you'll find that understanding the grammar is just one part of it. The real magic happens when you start to connect with the culture and the people and how they express themselves.
And conditional sentences with all their possibilities and subtleties are definitely a key part of that.
Absolutely. Now, before we say au revoir, I want to leave you with one final challenge, especially for those going for that pronunciator certificate. Don't just focus on memorizing the rules. Think about how you can use these conditional sentences creatively to express your own thoughts and ideas.
That's a great challenge. It's like taking all this knowledge and making it my own, finding my own voice in French.
Exactly. So go out there, practice those C clauses, and have fun with it.
And of course, ace that pronunciator test. We're rooting for you.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those C clauses flowing.
Au revoir and merci beaucoup for guiding us through this fascinating world of French conditional sentences.